If you are visiting with us or you're new here, my name is Adam Kennedy, pastor here. It's such a blessing to be here. And I started, I think it was October 2020, a few months before that American election that kind of threw the world in an uproar. It was 2.5 years ago now that fateful day on January 6th left its mark in our world, where the Capitol Hill in the States, that picture of democracy and freedom, was overrun by a mob, essentially. And what shook our world, and all the news, I'm sure, of the whole world were focused on, really only lasted less than 24 hours. Do you realize that? I'm sure the planning, and depending on who you listen to, it was all this big thing. But from when the protesting and rallies sort of started about 9 a.m. To the Capitol Hill, this place of government excellence, was overrun by civilians, really, until it got kind of silenced and squashed, and then they reconvened and did the vote to bring the new president in, which happened at 11 p.m. So you're looking at, you know, a little more than 12 hours. That one day changed drastically how the world viewed the states, changed drastically how the world, to some extent, viewed democracy and freedom and marches, and it was a shocking day for a lot of us. As I remember just watching it, just in awe, like, what is going on? A lot can happen in one day. We've all experienced it. I hope there's lots of good days you can point to that, like, wow, that day was an awesome day. God did some amazing things, you know, it was encouraging. I'll never forget this day. Maybe it's a wedding day, maybe it's the birth of a child, maybe it's the day you made that team you really wanted to make, you tried out, you practiced really hard and you made that team. There's also those really difficult days that change us, that we never forget. You know, the day we've lost someone, we get that diagnosis, we lose our job. There's those days that, you know, one day makes such a huge change and such a big difference. If you were with us last week, we did start on the book of Ruth, really focused around not so much Ruth at this point, but Naomi, Ruth's mother-in-law, who had just gone through 10 years of difficult times, having moved from her home in Bethlehem to Moab, a kind of an enemy territory. Due to a famine, she moved with her husband and her sons. While through that decade of living in this foreign place, she lost her husband, first of all. Then her sons married foreign women, Moabite women, and then her sons passed away. And it seems like it was about at that time that her sons had passed away. All she had was her and these two other widows that were her daughter-in-laws to kind of sort through what's next. She hears that there's food back in Bethlehem where she's from, and, you know, at least she's got some connections, some knowledge of that place. She's not seen as the enemy in Bethlehem, and so she decides to return back to Bethlehem. And last week we saw how she recognized that her two daughters-in-law, despite how much she appreciated what they had done and how deeply she loved them, she knew that they would be seen really as the enemy when she returns to Bethlehem. Israel and Moab were not on good terms. And so for Naomi to return, yeah, she'd be seen as an outcast as well because she abandoned them and went to Moab. But really it was probably her husband that made that call. He's long gone. One of her daughters-in-law decides, at Naomi's push and encouragement, like, you need to return. Go make a life for yourself. I have nothing to offer you. It's just going to be turmoil if you come with me. And one daughter-in-law goes, and one daughter-in-law says, no, I'm staying with you. And you can read it in Ruth's words. It's incredible. I'll read it here. It says, "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you, for where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you." I do believe that it's at this point we do see evidence of Ruth's, in modern day words, conversion, where she had been a Moabite. She had followed Moabite religions to some extent. She had seen something absolutely amazing in Naomi's life, particularly through all these 10 years of trials that Naomi has gone through and how she's dealt with those. And Ruth says, no, you've got something. I'm sticking with you. Not only do I love you, Naomi, and I'm going to not leave your side, but I'm going to follow your gods. I'm committing to your people. And it's at that point that Naomi recognizes, whether it's a great thing or not, or she recognizes the trouble that's going to come from this, she allows Ruth to go with them. So we've had these 10 days of struggles. She gets back to Bethlehem. The whole town is really shaken at this news about this widow who left with a husband and 2 sons, and how God has brought all this difficult times on her. And not only is she back after losing her husband and her sons, but she's brought a Moabite, one of her daughters-in-law, with her. And the whole town is shaken up, and I'm sure there's lots of, talking in the background, as small towns are known to do. But nonetheless, they are trying to survive, and that's where we enter into the chapter today. We're going to start in Ruth chapter 2. So if you do have a Bible, I encourage you, open it to that. We're going to work our way through the whole chapter together. I hope it's an absolutely encouraging morning for all of us. Let me pray before we read. Lord, as we look to you this morning, we can be thankful even for the rain, knowing that the rain brings what our world needs to survive, that without rain there would be a drought and famine, and that is in your hands as well. I thank you for this incredible town that we get to call home, our incredible country, that we get so many freedoms that many can't even begin to imagine. And as we take advantage of one of those freedoms of gathering this morning and diving into your word, we ask you to lead us, our hearts and our minds, lead my words as we dive into this incredible day in the life of Naomi and Ruth. As we see what one day can do, may we be encouraged this morning. And may it be a day in itself that we remember when those dark days, months, weeks, years come, that God, you can do so much in one day. In Jesus' name we pray all this. Amen. If you've got Ruth 2 opened up, the very first verse is a little bit out of place. It says, "Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz." Now that's just kind of the author giving a little preliminary info, some background to what we're about to read. There is a gentleman named Boaz who's connected to her passed away husband, which then also includes Ruth's passed away husband, that there's some family connection to there. We also learn that he's a worthy man. A word that we could translate as excellent. He's got excellence in character. Sometimes this does refer to excellence in like a stable wealth. Like he's gotten a decent status in the community. He's a worthy man. He's a successful man. He's kind. He's a quality kind of guy. And so we're given this little bit of background, which is interesting because it's clear here that Boaz was not like Naomi's deceased husband Elimelech, who did leave the land to go and try and find food in Moab. Boaz, we're led to believe, he stayed put. He took on the discipline of the Lord as the Lord disciplined the people of Israel during the famine, and now we see, as we're going to read, that he's doing all right. He's doing all right for himself. So let's go to verse 2 here. "And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, 'Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor.' And she said to her, 'Go, my daughter.'" Obviously, 2 widows that have just returned back to a nation that in itself is going to view them as with great suspicion. They've got very little. They've got almost nothing. They're probably trying to just kind of get settled in this new town. And unlike what we have today with food banks and social assistance, which I hope all of us can be a part of that to some extent, because there are people that do need that social assistance. And at times, that's going to be some of you, that we do need to take advantage of those food banks and opportunities. And that's one of the reasons we have that basket out front. I'll give a plug for the Living Hope Food Bank if you can support that. Bring a bag of food, that would be terrific. But of course, back in this day and age, that didn't exist. There wasn't a storage of food that the poor could go to and just kind of collect what they needed. And so it's at this day, something changes, and there's this conversation that has to be had where Ruth essentially says, look, Naomi, like we are going to starve. The cupboards are bare. There's nothing to eat. And it's at this point that Naomi kind of shares, well, actually there is some rules in God's law that he gave to Moses that we still follow today, where the poor and the foreigner, it does have some allowance to survive. Not a food bank like we have today, but instead what was allowed, and if you read Leviticus 19, 9 to 10, I'll read it here. This is God's law to the people. It says, when you reap the harvest of your land, when you're harvesting your crop, it says, you shall not reap your field right to its edge, neither shall you gather the gleanings, that's the leftovers that kind of fall as you're collecting the grains. After your harvest, you shall not strip your vineyard bare, neither shall you gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and for the sojourner, for I am the Lord your God. Now, if you remember, Bethlehem means house of bread, so really what was being grown in Bethlehem was bread products. But the rules here is, as you're harvesting Israel, as God says, you need to leave what's dropped, what kind of you miss in the shuffle of going through, to those that are poor, that are desperate. And it's their allowance to come behind and pick up the leftovers. And Naomi, I wonder if she was resistant to tell Ruth that this was even an option. Because remember, this is the time of the judges when everyone's doing what's right in their own eyes. So there is some real risk to Ruth's safety, and that becomes clear later on in their conversation. But for whatever reason, at this point, Ruth says, look, Naomi, I've got to go out and take advantage of this rule that's for us poor people, because we're going to starve. And Naomi probably reluctantly agrees and says, go, my daughter. Go ahead. And I imagine for Ruth herself, this was probably terrifying. This is still a new place for her. She probably doesn't really know where she's going. She has some idea of where the fields are that are growing and being harvested. But she doesn't know who's who, what belongs to who. And so she simply says, let me go. I'll try and find a field where they're not aggressive or mean and they don't kick me out. And Naomi eventually has to accept that, okay, go see what you can do. Go see what God will provide for us in this desperate time. So she sets out, verse 3. So Ruth set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was the clan of Elimelech. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to the reapers, the Lord be with you. And they answered, the Lord bless you. Then Boaz said to his young man who was in charge of the reapers, whose young woman is this? And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, she is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. She said, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers. So she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest. You got to love how this starts, where after Ruth goes, it says she happens to come upon the field of Boaz. We've already been introduced to Boaz. We already recognize that he is a worthy man, and we see that in the attitude of the workers here, where she asks permission, probably trying to identify the cultural norms of how to do this. She asks for permission, and they, working for Boaz, who's a worthy man, says, yeah, you're allowed to do that. That's part of the law. We can't really stop you unless we're going to go against God, even if they wanted to. And so she's allowed to glean there. And when they report back to Boaz, when he recognizes, oh, you have someone new here collecting, like who is this young woman that's collecting the gleanings? And they say, well, that's that Moabite woman. Do you notice that? He says it twice in that. She's that young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. Now, as far as being stuck with a title, being the Moabite woman is not a good one for Ruth to have, and yet that's what people equate her to, right? I'm sure we've all experienced that. We've probably all been guilty of it to some extent, where someone's experience, their history, their family, it's like, oh, that's so-and-so, they're related to that, that person that did this, right? Well, that was Ruth. She had this tag wherever she went. Oh, that's that Moabite widow. And yet, even in reporting this to Boaz, there's this interesting thing that's happened over the last few hours. Whatever their thought of Ruth when she started gleaning, you get a hint that they're a little bit impressed with her work ethic. Like she started out, and it's the heat of the day. You know, if I've never been to the Middle East, some of you have. This is hot work. She's probably on her hands and knees picking up what she can, and she's going at it for the sake of her and her mother-in-law. And they say, yeah, that's that girl we've been hearing about. That's that one that stirred up our whole town. Everyone's talking about, that's her. She's working really hard. She's been going nonstop except for a little rest. And it must have been interesting for Boaz to have this woman who, as we see in verse 12 of chapter 1, has stirred the whole town that everyone's talking about to be in his field. The one that everyone's buzzing about. And Boaz knows that actually her husband that's passed away, this widow, her husband was actually a relative of his as well. So you can sense, even in this picture of what's happening, that God is working some things out in the life of Ruth and Naomi. That she just happens to come upon this field where she's treated with dignity and care and allowed to carry out what she's legally, lawfully allowed to do. So then we get to the first interaction, verse 8. And then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn." Now, can you imagine in Ruth's mind, as she's probably very fearful of all these people working, and she notices that the master of the field has just shown up, and she's hoping she can just kind of keep a low profile. And after this discussion between the lead servant and the master, which turns out to be Boaz, that master turns and says, "You, Ruth, I need to talk to you." Can you imagine what was going through Ruth's mind? Like, either I'm going to get kicked out of here, they're going to tell me that I'm a foreigner's not welcome. Maybe something worse is going to happen. And then to receive these words that I'm sure Boaz is probably the first one to offer such gentle, caring words. "Listen, my daughter." Like those are words of gentleness and care. And clearly, it does deeply affect her. Ruth must have been awestruck. Not only was he in these words offering her a measure of safety that she had no clue was going to be available. He says, "Haven't I charged my young men not to touch you? Like, you can stay here." Boaz, he's also told her, stick with his young women. There's some sense that isolation that Ruth has experienced since the day she's come to Israel is starting to break down. Boaz says, "You stay with them. My men will protect you. You stay with them. And not only that, but feel free to go and take a drink whenever you'd like." This was, Old Testament times. They didn't have water bottles. Well, maybe they had some things like this, wineskins and things. But if they needed water out in the field, they needed to leave the field, at least for Ruth, leave the field, go to town, get to the community well, get some water, and then head back to the field. And so I'm sure for Boaz and his crew of workers, there was probably someone designated, take the buckets, go get water, so everyone can have water. It just makes sense versus everyone going on their own. And he says, "My daughter, when you're thirsty, just go over there. I know it's going to cost me a little bit because it's another mouth to provide drinks for where that worker could be doing other things. But just go and take some water when you need it." And I would expect she was probably in need of some water. And this kind of response where she likely anticipated the worst and she's shown such grace and care and protection, it clearly blows her away as you get to verse 10. "Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground.
and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your eyes that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?"
Do you see how she recognizes that label? But that's all she is to people? Like, why are you treating me with such care? To you, I'm just a foreigner.
And get his response. But Boaz answered her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to the people you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Let's stop there for a minute. A few notes of this really almost miraculous interchange between these two individuals is, I think it's quite evident of Boaz's character. We've already been introduced that he's a worthy man. He's a man of character. He's clearly following Old Testament law to some extent and allowing Naomi to glean. But not only that, he's actually gone over and above, treating those poor with respect and some help. And one of the things I love about Boaz's response here is, does that term Moabite come up? Now, I don't want to make this a bigger deal than it is, but to everyone else, Ruth was that Moabite widow, that woman that came from Moab, where Boaz looks at her and says, "I've heard what you've done for Naomi. I've heard how you've been loyal to her. I've heard how you've journeyed with her to a foreign place where, you were not going to be accepted. I've heard that. And you've been doing an incredible thing for her. May God bless you," he says. See, where the whole town at this point, all of Bethlehem, saw her as a foreigner, probably an outcast, and probably the enemy, how does Boaz see her? Boaz sees her as not the enemy. You've actually helped one of my own people. Far from the problem, you are providing the solution. I just get absolutely stunned about how these two ways of seeing the same person can come about, where one, she's from Moab, she's trouble, she shouldn't be here. Where he says, of course, she's from Moab. She has been walking with one of our people's widows through the darkest and deepest parts of their life, and she's been loyal to this point. Same person, two totally different perspectives. I think in the world around us, we can do this as well. We see people with different lenses that have different mannerisms and abilities in us and mental capacities in us, and we can see them as, they're a problem. But if we can look at them through the lens of how God sees people, actually, they're a huge blessing in our world. Yeah, they might take more financial strain on our social society. They might, I might not always get along with them in these ways. But God dearly loves them, and there's incredible things to celebrate in their life. I think all of us Christians can be challenged by Boaz's attitude towards someone that was viewed as trouble and an outcast. He sees the incredible good, the sacrifice that she's been willing to do. Doesn't just paint her with the brush of a Moabite, but he looks at her life and says, "You have done some incredible things. May God repay you for what you've done, Ruth." Such a loving response as this, again, it furthers the story of, I'm sure, how Ruth must have just been flabbergasted. Not only is this man being nice and gentle, not only is he carrying out the law to allow her to glean, but he's helping her in this way, and then he speaks such a prayer of blessing on her life. It's incredible. And you see from Ruth's response, she probably didn't know what to say. Verse 13, then she said, "I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not even one of your servants. And I put the word even in there. But you see, Ruth basically says, you've been so kind to me. This whole time I've lived in this country, everyone just views me as the enemy, and you've been so kind with your words and your actions and your prayers. It says, even though you really have nothing to gain from it, whatever Ruth collected was legally Ruth's to return back to Naomi. Providing this basic need of water, security, and even to some extent of an inclusion of a team was no doubt an incredible blessing. And I tell you, Ruth must have been on cloud 9, after that conversation. That fear was starting to melt away. The feelings of things are never going to get any better than this are probably starting to diminish a little bit. And she's probably feeling pretty good. Like, wow. I would expect she's thanking God as she works away on the ground, picking up what she can. And we get to verse 14, because the blessings for Ruth and ultimately Naomi are not over yet. And at mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine." So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed her roasted grain. And she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. When she arose to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, saying, "Let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. And also pull out some of the bundles for her, and leave it for her to glean, and do not rebuke her." I don't know if you've ever worked so hard on an empty stomach that you're just dying for anything. I'm sure most of you have. I'm younger than most of you, I think, and I have. There was this one trip we did. I did a portaging trip with some guys just after university. Portaging is essentially you take a canoe and all your camping stuff and all your food that you can handle, and you go out into the woods and you survive, basically, for a little while. And it was a preset trip. We knew our trail, and I wasn't in charge, thankfully, because this was my first one and only one. Tells you how it went. But we did this huge hike. One day we said, we're not going to go far today, because we've heard about this great hike up a mountain. And so we're going to do this hike. So we set our gear up, and we did this hike. It was a really fun hike. It was exhausting. We were all starving. And our snack guy or our food guy said, I'll take care of bringing something, so when we get to the top, we can enjoy some food together before we come back down. So we get to the top, and I'm telling you, everyone is like, okay, what did you bring? Like, we're starving. And no joke, he pulled out these warm, well-traveled avocados. Literally, just plain avocados. And at this point, I wasn't married yet. I was just out of university. I'd never tried avocado. And I thought, what is this? Like, at first, it's like, is this a joke? But he's like, no, it's like really good for you. It's good for energy. It's got what we need. Like, it'll help. And a lot of the other guys were similar to me. And they're like, what? Like, this is what you brought? But we were so hungry that we were willing to try it. Now, I didn't eat a whole one. Can you imagine just taking an avocado? You basically eat it like an apple, and you take the skin off. It was not appetizing, and there was a while before I gave it another chance. But that feeling of being so hungry that just anything would help. And here's Ruth, who probably hadn't eaten in that morning, right? Like, there's a reason she's out gleaning as a poor person, as a desperate person to get what she can, because she probably hasn't eaten anything up to this point. And then here's Boaz. It says, come here, come to my team, my crew, eat with us. Now, it doesn't sound like much to us, some roasted grain, bread, and a little bit of wine. But I guarantee for Ruth, this was an incredible blessing. Not only would her physical body have been deeply encouraged and satisfied, but I know her heart would have been thrilled at this as well. Again, this man that had already talked to her so kindly, prayed for her, provided security for her, is now offering food in such a desperate time, such an extraordinary kindness. And yet Boaz has even more surprises for her.
I presume it was fairly to the side, because he doesn't seem to make it obvious, but he tells his harvesters, he says, as harvest is happening, for her sake, just throw out a couple bundles. I'd expect Boaz has some idea of the desperation that Ruth and Naomi is in at this point, and he's simply trying to help. And this is incredibly generous. Boaz goes far beyond what the law of God required of him to do for the poor. Far beyond. To provide not only her immediate needs of food right then and there, and water and security, but also more of a long-term provision as well. And as we read, we see the day starts to come to a close. And so Ruth, everyone kind of packs it in for the evening. And I don't know how you beat out barley, but let's read 17. So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening, and then she beat out what she had gleaned. And it was about an ephah of barley. And she took it up and went into the city. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also brought out and gave her what food she had left after being satisfied. Let's stop there for a minute. An ephah of barley. If you read the little footnote that I'm sure all of us have in our Bibles, at the bottom it says 22 liters, right? Now I brought this just to give us some idea. This is our gardening bucket, but this is a 5-gallon pail. We've all seen these before, right? Hardware stores. This is 19 liters, right about 19 liters. So it tells you she had this much plus 3 more liters of barley that she took home that day. Now, in some ways, that's a miracle for a gleaner to go out and collect such a harvest. And you can imagine as she's heading home with her barley, I don't know what she carried it in, that we are not told that, but somehow she's got her barley and she's heading home, and I'm sure Naomi is on the edge of her seat, on her tippy toes, wondering, when is Ruth going to get home? Is she safe? Is everything, how did things go? And she's probably been praying all day for Ruth's safety and some sort of ability to get some food. And then she sees Ruth as Ruth enters the city off into the distance, and Ruth is struggling. And maybe at first she says, oh no, like what's happened? Then quickly she sees, no, she's not struggling from pain. She's carrying something. And she's carrying 22 liters of barley. And you must just understand how thrilled Ruth must have been, and Naomi, and just mind blown about how could this be. And not only does Ruth show up with a big smile on her face with 22 liters of barley, that's 2 weeks worth of food for 2 people. So they've now got food for 2 weeks. I did the research. Not only has she shown up with this food, but then to her great surprise, she pulls out this ready to eat, ready to enjoy food for Naomi. And no doubt Naomi is just like, what happened today? Verse 19, and her mother-in-law said to her, where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you. So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked. And she said, the man's name with whom I work today is Boaz. I'm sure at this response, Naomi became even more excited. This was from Boaz's field? You met Boaz? You see, she knew who Boaz was to some extent. We can read that in the next verse. But I wonder if Naomi was even more excited because this wasn't some person with some bigger plan of taking advantage of Ruth. This wasn't some stranger that she didn't know the motives. Ruth had stumbled upon, I think by God's direction and plan, a worthy man who treated her with grace, kindness, generosity. And so Ruth herself, Naomi here says, verse 20, Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, may he, Boaz, be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. Naomi also said to her, the man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers. Now that word does come up a lot more in the next chapter, so I'm going to save most of this discussion for that. But just to note, what Naomi recognizes in Boaz is someone that has done far more than he's required to do, but legally he is someone that is in a position that can do even more than they ever expected. So it must have just perked Naomi's mind a little bit. This is from Boaz? Boaz is actually someone that can help us even more so if he chooses to. But before they go too much into the Redeemer talk, Ruth probably interrupts again. Ruth the Moabite said, "Besides, he also said to me, 'You shall keep close to my young men until they have finished all my harvest.' And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, 'It is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, lest in another field you be assaulted.' So she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and the wheat harvests. And she continued to live with her mother-in-law." This was all one day. And it seems so far ago that they had nothing. They were starving, the cupboards were bare, they were in desperate times, where now they've got 2 weeks of food, which is a luxury in this day and age. They've got some inclusion. Ruth's got some security. Boaz has said, "Stay close to my young women. You will be safe and protected and take what you can." It seems so far away that they had nothing, and yet within 24 hours, I'm sure there was a great joy and hope that came over. Now we see she was able to glean there for the rest of the harvest season through the barley and wheat. So we get some fast forwarding happening, and next week we're going to enter in another unique couple of days. But what we do see is what a difference a day can make. How God can take 10 years of trials and desperation and pain and in one day do such a shift. That's the God we serve. Taking Ruth and Naomi from an emptiness to being plentiful. And we know God can continue to do that today. And today might not be your day. It might be one of those days of the 10 years that just seems like difficult and pain, and you don't see the end. You can't see it getting better. But then we look at the story of Ruth and how one day so much changed. Not only was there inclusion and security and food and safety and water, there was also someone that seemed to genuinely care for her and look out for her. We're not promised any sort of financial security in following Christ. There are many Christians in our world that are poor. So if you're here and you think, if I just follow God, then he'll fill my bank account, that's definitely not what he promises to do. But he does promise something far better. In Philippians 4, we read Paul as he's writing. He says, "I have learned in whatever situation I am in to be content. I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me." Paul says it doesn't matter how full my cupboards are. I've learned the secret. The secret he's referring to is not about our physical condition, our physical state. It's about knowing that God's love has been so strong and so powerful that he sent Jesus Christ to this earth on our behalf. Boaz was incredibly generous. He sacrificed, time from his own people giving water. He sacrificed his own harvest for Ruth's sake. Sacrificed his own meal for his guys, for Ruth's sake. And yet we compare that to God, and God sacrificed his son for our sake. There is no more generous gift than what God has given us. So in Philippians 3, Paul says, "Whatever gain I had in this world, whatever gain I had, however people looked at me, I count all that for loss for the sake of Christ. Indeed, I count everything as loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord. For
For his sake I have suffered the loss of all things and count them as rubbish, in order that I may gain Christ and be found in him. Paul was willing to consider everything in this world as expendable because he knew the one thing that mattered was his life in Jesus Christ. He was part of God's people. He was a son of God. And in that, it didn't matter what life threw at him. He would continue to celebrate and pursue after that. All of us are invited to experience this righteousness through faith in Jesus Christ. If you haven't done that today, that is a generous gift of God that he gave on your behalf as well. And you can consider that. If you have any questions, please talk to me. Let me pray as the worship team comes up to close us.